Okay, I think we can make a start. I put the record button on, so we are being recorded. Everyone is happy with that. Our speaker has agreed for the recording to be made, and it's something that we do as a matter of course in the CVC, if possible, and we can put it in our archives and show it on our website. So welcome everyone to the first event of the CVC Centre for Visual Cultures, for those who are new to us then. The first event of the spring term. I have to say that the way the strike action has been planned, it could be one of the very few events of this term. All the more reason then to enjoy what is going to be a fantastic talk, I know, from our speaker Alessandra Ferrini. And I'm going to ask Fabrizio straight away to introduce Alessandra. We'll then have her presentation and there'll be a chance for discussion afterwards. If people want already to be putting questions in the chat, we can pick them up after Alessandra has spoken. And I look forward to opening it up to everyone on the floor, the virtual floor. But I'm going to pass straight away then to my co-member of the CVC, Fabrizio Di Donno.
Thank you, James. It's a great pleasure for me to introduce Alessandra Ferrini for tonight's talk. Alessandra is a London-based visual artist and researcher and a PhD candidate at the University of the Arts, London. Her practice spans across filmmaking, installations, performance lectures, and editorial work, as well as educational work, especially with schools in Italy. Alessandra's work takes a practice-based approach to historiographic and archival research in the attempt to re-signify the history of Italy and the Italian heritage, questioning the enduring legacies of Italian colonialism and fascism, and bringing the past and the present together in a network of relations between Italy, the Mediterranean region, and Africa. In a lot of her work, as we will see tonight, Alessandra experiments with the expansion and hybridization of the documentary film, and she often uses her voice through a voiceover to frame her positionality in relation to the Italian heritage she aims to resignify. Alessandra has exhibited internationally, including Manifesta 13, Le Parallèles du Sud, Sharia Film Platform, Villa Romana, Second Lagos Biennial, Istanbul Biennial's Collateral et Depot, Manifesta 12 film program. Her writings have been published on the Journal of Visual Culture, Harun Farocki Institute, and by Sternberg Press and Manchester University Press. She was also the recipient of the 2017 London Film Festival's Experimenta Pitch Award, and more recently, the winner of the Maxi Bulgari Prize 2022 in Rome, with her video installation, Gaddafi in Rome, Notes for a Film, a project which was the result of 6 years of research into the Libyan leader's visit to Italy in 2009. This is a work in 3 acts, with images and news produced in real time during Gaddafi's visit, together with archival material collected and manipulated by the artist. Tonight's talk, entitled Italy-Libya from Genocide to Diplomatic Friendship, is indeed based on this latest work, and we are particularly excited to have you here with us tonight, Alessandra, to talk to us about it. So, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Fabrizio, for this thorough and wonderful introduction. And thank you, James and Anna, for the organization as well. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm going to share my screen. Hopefully everything is going to be smooth. Yeah, can you all see?
We can.
Yeah, brilliant. Okay, so I've divided this presentation, let's say, in 2 parts. So the first one is going to go quite in depth into this research that around Gaddafi's visit to Rome in 2009 that Fabrizio has just mentioned, and the work Gaddafi in Rome, Notes for a Film. And I thought about going a bit more in depth into the methodological approach, specifically around practice-based research. And then I'm going to go to part 2, where I'm going to be just talking through another body of work that is also an offshoot of the same research around Gaddafi and the relations between Italy and Libya, but that focuses more on the representation of the genocide that happened in Libya at the end of the 20s, beginning of 30s. And I'm just going to be finishing on a more kind of speculative note on some sort of framework that I'm building for the research, because I am at the moment finishing my thesis, the writing around this research. And as Fabrizio mentioned, it has taken a good 6 years to do this work. I've been doing my PhD part-time, so it's a lot. Kind of this film is the end of a long process, and yeah, so I'm in the moment right now of kind of reflecting back and coming up with a new sort of way of looking at the work and a new framework. So just to start, I wanted to say that I've been working on the Italian colonial past specifically since around 2014, which is also the moment I started my practice as an artist and researcher. And these encounters for me happened here in London. What I mean is that before, I have never been taught this part of history, growing up in Italy. So it's all part for a long process for me that started in 2012, really, when I first lived with a Libyan friend, and then I realized how little I knew about this history, and that's what started all the process and my practice as it is now. So that's for me it's particularly important to always come back to this, because I think it's really a symptom of the state of colonial memory and education system in Italy, the one that I was brought up in. It's slightly better now, but there's still, a long way to go. And I think it's always important to remember that, but also I will try to be as specific as possible in terms of historical references. And if I'm not, let me know if I need to precise anything, because I'm aware not a lot of people are very well versed on the Italian colonial history and the colonial past. So yeah. So, now, my research revolves around the idea of this notion of the essayistic. So I do work with the documentary film, the idea of hybridizing, expanding this medium. And by essayistic, I mean what Timothy Corrigan conceived as a mode that stretches across media, an approach to non-fiction and research that is both a thinking and making form. So in doing so, this definition resonates with Nora Alter's 2007 argument that the potential of the essayistic is the translatability of ideas, genre, and media into other forms. What I mean by this is that I work a lot in thinking how translating one media into another unlocks different potential of transmission, different ways of relaying research. And so very often my work kind of happen through a series of passages from one media to another. So to arrive to this film, for instance, I firstly developed a series of performance lectures where I actually developed the structure for the film. So in its expansion from and out of the literary essay and subsequently beyond the essay film, the essayistic presents itself as a slippery term, difficult to define as it conflates a wide range of approaches, sometimes contrasting and belonging to other genres, media or disciplines. Such permeability requires its practitioners to sit with and push such porousness, moving across genres, media, and disciplines. So defining one's work as essayistic, I believe, is a deliberate operation aiming at situating a practice within an intrinsically hybrid realm. To embrace this term, I argue, signals a willingness to engage with its ambiguous and far-reaching nature, while placing one's work within a history of experimental practitioners concerned with the critique of traditional documentary practice and involved at once in the expansion and the hybridization of non-fiction practice and thinking. In addition, and most importantly, it also implies a political commitment because it's a desire to think with and among practitioners and thinkers that have attempted to reflect on the politics of visuality and their own positionality. So through its self-reflexive character, indeed, the essayistic implies a situated approach. So in my practice, overall, actually, I do scrutinize the formation and perpetuation of way of seeing, being, and thinking that has its roots in colonialism, racism, and fascism within the Italian context, as Fabrizio has mentioned before. And a lot of this, it's really thinking through, my positionality as a white Italian researcher based in London since my late teenage, so really having spent most of my life here actually rather than in Italy. And so the work I'm doing, I'm attempting to analyze, deconstruct, and counteract my gaze, be mindful of the specific privileges and biases that this position of both insider and outsider affords me. And when I talk about privileges and being insider and outsider, I speak, about a sort of a plethora of different ones, but in particular, I'll refer to the fact that I'm aware of the privilege that my whiteness affords me in doing research around colonial trauma and violence in terms of not being re-traumatized and triggered during research. And at the same time, also, I am aware of the fact that working from the UK, I'm able to access resources and doing a job really that doesn't exist in Italy, because a practice-based research, as I'm conducting here with a scholarship and support, does not exist in Italy. So these also, of course, afford me a different privilege towards the Italian context as well. At the same time, much of the work I produce is produced really into this kind of being close and at the same time having a distance from the object of my research. So is this working? Yeah. So my thesis is titled Gaddafi in Rome, Dissecting a Neo-Colonial Spectacle. And it develops a set of tactics rooted in the essayistic for the dissection of a specific historical and political event that is defined within this research as a 21st century neo-colonial spectacle. That is the meeting held in Rome in June 2009 between former Libyan leader Muammar Gaddafi and former Italian Prime Minister Silvio Berlusconi. So in June 2009, as you can see here in the color image on the left, Gaddafi set foot on Italian soil for the very first time to celebrate the signing of the Treaty of Friendship, Partnership and Cooperation between Italy and Libya. After a century of stormy dealings, such a turning point in the relations between Italy and Libya was fueled by Italy's need to secure fuel supply and to stop the arrival of migrants on its southern shores. In exchange, Italy had to bend to Gaddafi's request for colonial reparations in the form of financial investments and infrastructural work. While in Rome, instead, the two premiers also ratified the bilateral agreements on migration, which cemented the pushback policy, the forced return of migrants crossing the Mediterranean Sea to Libya, where they are incarcerated in detention centers that violate human rights. Such agreement remained more or less constantly operative, even during the Libyan uprising and in its aftermath. While on the other hand, it opened the door to similar agreements between the EU and neighboring states. So as Gaddafi was greeted in Rome at the airport here by Berlusconi, as you can see in this picture where they are at Ciampino Airport in Rome, Gaddafi sported a controversial photograph pinned to his chest, a portrayal of anti-colonial fighter Omar al-Mukhtar in chains surrounded by Italian colonial officers that was taken before his execution in 1931, and you can see it here on your screen on the right. So pointing to the indelibility of colonial trauma, Gaddafi's gesture provoked serious outrage in the Italian political class. Yet the image itself was for the most ignored, unable and unwilling to articulate or engage with what the image captures. It was merely interpreted as a symbol of Gaddafi's untrustworthiness, thus highlighting the deeply rooted denial of accountability regarding the colonial past. So my PhD research very much stems out of this image here. This image that for me incarnates different temporalities. First of all, we are looking, we are sort of 12, 13 years, 13, almost 14 years ago. And the situation in Libya and Italy is very different from back then. But this meeting also set the scene for a lot of the issues that we're still dealing with in terms of international relations. And at the same time, it's also an image that opens up sort of a portal onto the past with the image of the use of this image within an image that, to quote Chiara De Cesare, which is this image that Gaddafi has been on his chest. And also another set of material that really started my research is an archive of live news updates that La Repubblica, the Italian newspaper, traditionally on the center left, published during the 3 days of the event. So throughout the 3 days, you have an overview here. All of these lists, timestamp lists, can be expanded into short paragraphs. But basically, throughout the 3 days, La Repubblica almost obsessively reported minute by minute the meeting. And then because of this exceptional reportage, they actually also archived it in a special way. So the premise of my film really, as my research was, could I turn this material into a script, into a film script? And what does it do? What is the value of these live news updates? And when they are all together, actually archived like that, I refer to them as news feed. So what does this news feed do as a document? And I've used critical discourse analysis, for instance, and also I've been looking at, it'll become clear later when I play a short extract, but also it becomes clear in turning them into a film, which is something I've been experimenting with, how, for instance, very trivial information is given even more space than very important information that the Italian public knew very little about, as in relation to the colonial past, for instance. So now the focus of my practical output, as I was saying, was to turn this into a film. And so the very first part of my research was trying to think about the temporality of this news as well, and also to try and understand how they could be translated into a film form in a way that they wouldn't be too manipulated, that they could still be tested in their own kind of raw document form. And the final and main output that I produced, and it was exhibited in Rome last summer, is actually a 3-channel video. So it's 3 different videos, and that's modulated on the 3 days. So each video actually portrays one of the 3 days of the event, and it follows the 3-act structure, which is a very common form of storytelling. But the 3 days seem to kind of almost mimic this. So the idea of having an inciting incident on the first day, which for me in this film is Gaddafi's use of Omar al-Mukhtar image, because it comes to celebrate friendship, but yet it's still reminding that what's the kind of violence that the Italians unleashed on Libyans. And this, I have to say, and you'll see it in the extract I'm showing you, this actually comes 3 months after Berlusconi officially apologized for colonial past in Sirte in Libya. And then Act 2 is the second day, and then Act 3 is this sort of resolution, which is not entirely a resolution, But the 3 days, so the second day, is actually unfolding around a lot of contestations, a lot of protests, both from the political class and the students, La Sapienza, for instance. And then the third day, we have a lot of economic deals, Gaddafi going to Confindustria for all the sort of economic deal and sort of magically restoring sort of peace. So yeah. So I'm gonna stop there, and I'm gonna show you a very short extract. It's a 5-minute extract from Act 1, so the first day. And this one is very much look at what I would like to delve into today, which is to do with the idea of diplomatic friendship. So yeah, I'm just gonna play it. I hope you can hear. If you have any issue, just let me know.
1419.
So.
$17.10. $18.39. $20.26. $20.52. $20.55. $20.57. $2100. $21.27. $21.44.
I need to pause for a moment. I want to go back in time to August 2008, when the Treaty of Friendship, Partnership and Cooperation was firstly signed by Berlusconi and Gaddafi in Benghazi. Precisely to the speech that Berlusconi gave and to his address to the Libyan Parliament the following March. Un ringraziamento affettuoso e cordiale al vostro leader, che ha voluto fortissimamente arrivare a firmare questo accordo. Accordo che giunge dopo quei momenti tragici e drammatici dell'occupazione italiana del vostro paese. A nome del popolo italiano, come capo del governo, mi sento in dovere di porgere le scuse e manifestare il nostro dolore per quello che è accaduto tanti anni fa e che ha segnato molte delle vostre famiglie. Il vostro leader ha voluto mettere fine a questo periodo, a questi lunghi anni in cui i nostri due paesi hanno sì collaborato, ma sono stati divisi nel ricordo di quello che è successo in quegli anni. Il vostro leader ha voluto che guardassimo avanti e costruissimo per tutti, ma soprattutto per i nostri giovani, un'amicizia che potesse rendere i nostri popoli più felici. Perciò abbiamo avuto la felicità di poter preparare e firmare qui davanti a voi questo atto, che denuncia la nostra volontà di lasciare alle spalle tutto il passato e il suo dolore e di guardare al futuro con una collaborazione concreta in tutti i campi, anche in campo internazionale, dove saremo fianco a fianco per diffondere la pace nel mondo.
Accuso il nostro passato di prevaricazione sul vostro popolo e vi chiedo perdono. Lavoreremo insieme con il vostro leader per il bene dei nostri due popoli.
Berlusconi carefully avoids making direct reference to the violence Italians committed in Libya or to colonialism more broadly. This past chapter, that is supposedly closed, remains unnamed and undefined. By stressing the distance of this past and the importance of moving forward, these speeches further distance Italians from these events, thus denying an opportunity to foster awareness and accountability. Unlike the frenzy triggered by Gaddafi's visit to Rome, Berlusconi's performance of guilt is ignored by the mainstream press. Colonial reparations are therefore concealed from public opinion.
Okay, I'm back. So that's, as I said, it's 5 minutes. Each act is 20 minutes. Each act also has a different kind of aesthetics. I can't see anything, so I hope let me know with the audio if there's anything wrong. So now, intertwined with this material, as obviously I used a lot of archival material, especially stuff available online from media, journalistic reports, and also different kind of YouTube amateur video as well. I also performed in Rome. So as you can see in this image, I actually pinned a tablet to my chest to mimic Gaddafi's use of Omar al-Mukhtar image. And I walked through different places in Rome that were significant for the meeting between Gaddafi and Berlusconi. First day, I went to the Senate in Rome, which was actually interdicted to Gaddafi. And then the second day, I went to the Capitol and the Roman ruins. They are just behind it, as you can see here. So in Act 2, you have this footage. And I just played the Lion of the Desert on the tablet. The Lion of the Desert being a film that was actually financed by Gaddafi. It came out in 1981. It stars Anthony Quinn in the role of Omar al-Mukhtar, and it really tells the history of the violence that Italians unleashed on the Libyan resistance. And it was being sort of censored in Italy. So basically, it's never been it's been interdicted from distribution in Italy since 1981, and it was specially broadcasted on Sky TV on the day that Gaddafi arrived to Rome, which is private TV. So there was some sort of way around the sort of soft ban that was put on the film. So the idea, and then the last day I actually went to the EUR, and so which is a fascist, the quarter, the district in Rome built by fascism, and this is where Confindustria has its headquarters. So it's where Gaddafi then ended this meeting, stipulating all sort of economic deals. So overall, the work creates a constant temporal shift from micro to macro events by focusing on minute details of Gaddafi's visit through La Repubblica's obsessive reporting and relating them to a wider timeline that highlights colonial continuities from the early 20th century to today. And at the same time, it also tried to, without being very obvious about it, but to sort of weave out how the kind of language La Repubblica, which is supposed to be a center-left newspaper, sort of Orientalist language that is used as well. And to me, this is something that's always very important in my work, is that it's really to show how the coloniality is really pervasive and it's not obviously confined to the right. So in terms of approach, this work aims at cutting through the surface of the event. So a lot of the first act really try to do that, try to think about how do you go behind the event of this media spectacle and then so it's trying to, and in that sense, it's trying to dissect the event. So by using this term to dissect the event for a very long time at the beginning of my research, to think about how I was going to look at this event in a very minute detail through the, live news chronicle, I ended up actually developing this approach, this sort of series of tactics that that are influenced by the history of dissection. And so this sort of dissection is enacted through a series of tools, the tactics borrowed from the medical practice of public dissection. In particular, it takes inspiration from the performative, diagnostic, and pedagogical aspects of the anatomical theater, while contrasting its positivist epistemological roots through the employment of a position and subjective voice. So through a personal voiceover, the film aims to deconstruct and contest the Italian archive of coloniality, namely that multi-layered collective repository of aspiration, dominance, desire, self-aggrandizement, and fear, through which the development of society's self-image can be revealed. So I'm going to just go a bit through the history of dissection. I'm not going to be too long because we don't have a lot of time, but so the idea of developing dissection through the atheistic is very much linked to different approaches to the way I've been engaging with the material in this film, especially the material I've collected throughout the research, and the way I've been thinking of the way to perform a sort of public, a sort of process of knowledge production. And in that, and to me, the essayistic is very much linked to this approach as well. And also the early history, the early performances of public dissection also very much try to enact this kind of process. And here is but I've been looking specifically at the very early medieval practice of public dissection in Italy, which begins in Italy, and this is before the founding of modern anatomy with Vesalius. And to me, what was really striking here is that the performance of public dissection here involves three different people performing it, different actors. We've got the lecturer, which sits up high and reads from a book of approved knowledge. So it doesn't really use the dissection as a diagnostic kind of practice, but it just reads aloud. And then the other two characters are the sector. Of course, it's just the person that casts the body. And then, to me, the very interesting person in this is this ostensor. And the ostensor is the person that is in between and points and sort of act as a connection between the voice and the hand and the body, and also as an interface with the audience. And so a lot of the montage and the way I film, that I try to think about how I use my material in the film, it's really been informed and influenced by this, by thinking about the interconnection between these roles. And this is to do with the fact that I am interested in the way basically knowledge was performed through this setting, to this scenography, and that is this kind of choreography. And this is what I'm trying to build on with my work. And then the other underlying sort of concern was to think about the different viewing perspective and that the anatomic gaze affords us. And so Act 1 focuses very much on the outside, on the surface, on the topicality, which is also, of course, characteristic of the news, not only of anatomy. And at the same time, so how do we cut through and go beyond the surface of the event? And then Act 2 very much focuses on getting really close. So the idea of a sort of a microscopic gaze, and so it goes into the cellular detail. And then the last act, Act 3, it's the idea that by going in through the dissection, the last part that we access to is actually the structure. And the structure, in a way, after we go in zooming in, we are sort of zooming out to look at sort of the systemic, and so a much more dilated and expansive sort of questions. And so here, this last act very much tried to zoom out and look at this very long temporality that I've been dealing with in the film, which goes from 1911, which is the beginning of the Italian occupation of Libya, and arrived to today, really, because it looks at the continuities as well of the bilateral agreements between Berlusconi and Gaddafi. So this is a long journey, and this sort of devices that I've developed through the dissection have helped me calibrating and decide how to manipulate the material. At the same time, it was a conscious operation for me to focus on early medieval dissection, also because it's not diagnostic in attempt and not scientific as we intend today in intent. So it is much more performative and pedagogic than it is actually diagnostic. So this is just some images to show how it was presented in the gallery space at Maxi. I'm also working on a feature film now, but this is obviously, it had to be presented in a gallery, so I developed a specific kind of format for that, installative format, again, inspired by the anatomic theater. And then inside there are the 3 different suspended screens with the 3 different acts. And finally, the kind of element of the table, which is very important in dissection, but it's also very, very important in essay filmmaking. And this is why, as well, I feel this kind of relations between the 2 practices, because a lot of the time, essay filmmaking is enacted onto a table, the editing table, or is enacted through desktop screen, desktop editing, which again is a sort of the recreation of this idea of a table, an editing table. So now this is the first part. Second part is going to be faster, but I just wanted to just discuss a little bit where I went from there, and parallel to this sort of deep diving into this event. And so while I was doing the research around the picture of Gaddafi and Berlusconi, I found out that in Rome, at the University of Roma Tre, there is a big collection of images from the capture and execution of Omar al-Mukhtar, which spanned over a course of 4 days. And this collection of images wasn't accessible for a long time. I mean, it was accessible, but it wasn't publishable because of a legal kind of limbo that the pictures were in. So when I went to the archive, Dr. Alessandro Volterra, who is a historian and the archivist there, he had this incredible way of explaining what the images meant and why they were so important, and he had a manuscript ready to be published all around the analysis of these pictures, which are very important because we have very, very little documentation from the time, and also we have sort of contrasting versions, for instance, of the court case, so at the process or the trial. So the images help sort of understanding exactly what happened, which version might be the right one. But since it couldn't publish the images, it couldn't publish the book. And so what we did is he allowed me actually to film the images. I was really intrigued by the way he was talking about them and describing them, and in 10 minutes would take you through these 80 images, explaining everything very well. So at first I record the audio, and then he allowed me to also record the video. And we did this film, which is a short film, 20 minutes film called Sight and Scene, in which you almost see the images, but you never really quite can see them properly. But you can hear him actually describing the images, and you can make a mental kind of image, and you can conjure it up and understand why, the importance of them. And then, so this was a way to subvert censorship in a way, or anyway, legal issues. And then finally, last year, he was able to publish the book. So I'm very happy that he managed to do that. And the film actually first came out in 2018 and the last version in 2020. Now, in this film, Alessandro uses a term that he came up with while he's talking about the images, and there's a term, iconographic silence, to describe the ban on the documentation of the violence that was happening in Libya at the time. So I need to step back. So basically, between 1922, which is the year that fascism took power in Italy, and 1931-32, that's the time, this is a decade that we call the pacification of Libya, in which the Italians tried to really crush the very strong resistance in the eastern part of Libya, the region of Cyrenaica, that was spearheaded by Omar al-Mukhtar. And during this period, at the end of the 20s, that meant the construction of concentration camps, the use of chemical weapons, and the actual genocide of the Senussi population. And at the time, Graziani, so there was a ban on the documentation of what was happening. That's why we have very little in terms of documentation, both photographic and not. So I was intrigued by this idea of this iconographic silence, as he called it. And last year I worked on another project called Unruly Connections. And Unruly Connections is an installation in two parts. I'm only going to talk about one part. This part is the one in which I continue thinking about how I could engage with the genocide in Libya. How can I work on making these more known and engage with the repercussions that had. But at the same time, how can I do that from my positioning in a way that isn't completely re-traumatizing for the people who are still living in the memory of this trauma and this violence. So this is something I've been trying to develop as a framework for a while. It is, how do you educate specifically Western Italian people without actually all the time just re-traumatizing and using shock value tactics and so on. So in this specific work, I was also influenced by a sort of reading group I was going through with a few friends, and a text by Tuck and Young, actually I have it here, which is called The R Words, Refusing Research, in which Tuck and Young, who are two researchers of indigenous origins, they actually talked about the fact that they all constantly ask to talk about their pain. The communities are constantly studied because of their pain, and how can they actually get out of this? That for them is really a main characteristic of peculiarity of research. So how can they get out of this and think about what they call desire-driven paradigm? So I'm thinking about, a framework, desire-based framework. How does that apply to what I am doing in my position and the kind of engagement I'm having my subjects from my own positioning. And so in the end, I decided to work on were different attempts to circumvent this iconographic silence. So different people who have single-handedly, like individually, taken it on themselves to try to document the genocide in different ways that allow them to bypass somehow the censorship. And this resulted in 3 different people that I concentrated on. And one was the Jesus Ailu, and this was the focus of the exhibition. I commissioned the translation of this book. It's a book that was written in Tigrinya language, so it is a language spoken in Eritrea and part of Ethiopia. And this is a story of conscript. Actually, is not accurate. We discovered by doing the translation. The title is not appropriate, precise. The English translation title, because it is not being conscripted. It goes. This person goes voluntarily and joins the Italian army. So while Eritrea is under Italian occupation, and he's sent amongst a group of Eritreans, so other Eritrean soldiers, to fight in Libya, so to repress the Libyan anti-colonial resistance. And it's a really poignant book, one of the earliest examples of anti-colonial literature, because it's supposedly written in 1927 and is passed down orally until 1953, when it's actually published in Tigrinya, and then it's never published again. So only some copies in Tigrinya survived, and then in 2012-13. Gilmay Gash actually translated it into English. So for my exhibition, I was able to commission the translation of the book into Italian, but from the original Tigrinya. And Dr. Yuval Cleati Dirar, who's not only who's actually a historian and is an expert of the history of Askari, so the European indigenous soldiers brought to that they were used by the Italian army, actually translated the book. And I'm really happy to announce finally that the book is going to be published next year by TAMU. So we are working now on the publication. And I was very happy to be able to sort of hijack the budget of the installation, because not always the gallery provide you a budget that you can use to do this kind of things. So there was quite a lot of negotiation, and this is kind of part of what I do, a lot of those kind of negotiations, because research and this kind of work is not naturally fitting the gallery and museum system, let's say art production. And then the translation was released in different chapters throughout the exhibition. It was installed in the exhibition space as the exhibition progressed. And then I had 2 other people that I engaged with in the space, and they're writing. One is Leda Raffanelli, who's the Italian feminist, Muslim anarchist, who converted to Islam in 1900 during a visit in Alexandria when she was 20. She was a prolific publisher of anarchist pamphlets and magazines. And then she had a brief relation with Mussolini in 1913. And then in her 20s, while she was under heavy surveillance, she managed to write a book called L'Oasi, Romanzo Arabo, so sort of the Oasis, an Arab novel, which she published under the pen name, Etienne Gamalier. And she put herself in the book as a translator from French to Italian, where actually was her work. And the work is talking about Tunisia, not Libya directly, and the main story is a love story, sort of a kind of pink literature, how we call it in Italy. And that allowed her to bypass the censorship. So she managed to publish a really strong critique to colonial occupation that alluded to the Libyan situation, but not directly. And this was in 1929. And then the last person I focus on is Nudon Boy, who's a Danish journalist who converted to also to Islam, joined the Libyan resistance against the Italian occupation, and then eventually managed to publish his memoir, Desert and Countries. It's a diary of his journey in Northern Africa, which includes actually pictures of the Italian repressions of the Libyan resistance, and also explains in quite great detail the kind of violence of the time. And then Nudon Boy was killed in 1931 while he was going to Mecca, and it's kind of well known that he probably was under Italian orders, that he was killed at the border between Jordan and Saudi Arabia, but there's never been a proof. And part of why I focus on this as well is because during August 2020, I was contacted by an anonymous person online who claimed to have proof that Saudi Arabia and Italy colluded in killing Nudon Boy in 1931, and he asked me to go to the National Archives in Kew to find a specific document to help him out, which I eventually did, but by then he was disappeared. I had no other kind of way of contacting him, and in the exchange on Twitter, he asked me to make a film about Nudon Boy's story, and all of these exchanges is in the exhibition as well. And to finish off, this exhibition was, it works on literature, the idea of literature trying to, even though we have not really much in terms of images of what's happening, but kind of narrative literature help still publishing and circulating these testimonies. And I was interested in terms of thinking about after the reading in Tak and Young, thinking about desire-driven framework. And I was thinking about the kind of framework I could develop, which wouldn't be one focusing on, the atrocities and the pain, but would be offering an alternative and examples of a way of resisting to cultural practice, to way, in this case, to literature, rather than, being the pain. Obviously, the violence is there, but also the images of violence have been shielded by these reflective and transparent panels that are applied into the images that are printed onto the wall. So there's also this work on thinking of shielding. I haven't used any, real strong image of violence anyway, but I'm just trying to think about how to dilute, how to sort of shield, but also with a reflecting surface that reflects the image of the viewer as well. So sort of a way of bringing you back into this history and sort of interrogating yourself as well on where you're standing on this. So this just to, I'm not going to go much into detail because I think we're getting late, but all I wanted to say is that this for me has been a way to think about all of this work and realizing that what I'm trying to build for my work is what I call an accountability framework, and it's something I'm developing at the moment. And this idea, and this came for me from a realization of how it was impossible for me to translate the word accountability in Italian, and actually this is a common issue, and it's just generally translated as responsibility, but responsibility is not the same as accountability. And so what I've been trying to think about is to the work I'm doing, what does it mean to have as a goal this sort of accountability framework, and it was also influenced by looking very closely at, for instance, Berlusconi reparations, that kind of language of apology and, taking responsibility, which is totally performative. And so it started to make me think much more in terms of, what does it mean to be accountable when we're thinking about historical responsibility. What does it mean to be accountable for the work I do and put in the world? And who, if accountability is demanded by an oath to a forum or a community, then what is this? And also it means that it is a work of care for me. And so this is the sort of, the sort of framework I'm trying to develop as I go forward. But I will stop it here and then perhaps we can talk about it. And I hope it wasn't too rushed. I know there was quite a lot to pack in. I'm going to stop sharing the screen. I've lost you all. Here, stop sharing.
Thank you, Alessandra. That was such an exciting and packed talk, covering so many things. It's hard to know where to start, to be honest. But I do have some questions I'd like to ask you, in particular about your practice-based research, just the nature of the practice. But I wonder if people want to put their hand up virtually or put in the chat a question. We can take it immediately. If not, then I'll kick off myself, if that's okay. Okay, then I'll just ask really, well, first of all, a very basic question, which is that film available, Gaddafi in Rome, to see in its entirety?
Only, I mean, if people contact me, I will send a link, a private link, but yeah, no, it's not online.
Okay.
I'm happy to share a private link, but yeah.
Well, I'll be in contact then with you to see it. But it was precisely that's a question of the practice then within your PhD research and how that is the kind of the fulcrum really of the research. That's what is generating the research and the ideas around violence and the ongoing history of coloniality, as you call it, neo-colonialism. And I suppose I want to ask you the question that perhaps was implied by what you were saying, and especially towards the end about accountability, but the ethical questions of your research, the ethical dimension of it. I mean, for me, it is, what you're doing is very brave in so many ways. I mean, going into the archives of violence, of colonial violence and on, I mean, to the present day. And what do you do with that? I mean, what is the experience of going into the archives? It seems to me that what you are insisting on is you've got to engage directly. You've got to dissect, as you did. You cut through the image. I mean, that is a brave step to make. I mean, you know, I've worked on African cinema, and lots of it is about violence, but I never filmed. Practice was never part of that experience. I was writing about it. You are, as a filmmaker, going into the archives then, and whether it's in the film or the installation work, engaging at this visceral level with the history of violence. Mm-hmm. And you know, I was thinking about the work of someone like Shahini Chowdhury, the whole sort of question of how do you engage with the spectacle of violence, and is there a way of dealing with violence in a violent way that doesn't reproduce the story of violence, and somehow offers a way of reflecting on violence. I mean, she talks about affective thinking. So for her, it's about affect. I don't think you talked about affect, unless I missed that word or something like it. But I'm just wondering then, in terms of an ethics of violent practice, I mean, is it an aesthetics of violence that you're actually pursuing, and which becomes an ethics of violence, in order to really get to those things which are still, you know, not spoken about, which are covered up, which are smothered by the press or what have you? Is that what has to be done, I suppose, is my question.
No, I think, I mean, especially with the last work I was talking about, it was precisely the opposite, is to think about how do you take responsibility for something that in Italy is virtually, you know, unknown. and not only in Italy, because, if you're looking at the book that just came out a year and a half ago by Ali Hamida, Genocide in Libya, who's really, reconstructing the whole history of the genocide in Libya. This is something that's also not been discussed in sort of genocide studies as well. So, it's really a history that has been sort of concealed, let's say, or erased. And so it is important to take, to sort of confront ourselves with, at least when I'm using the us, I'm talking from a sort of Italian white perspective. But so I think it's something that we need to sort of, deal with. But then how do you do that in a way that is not completely re-traumatizing? And so there was the idea is that you don't not to focus on the violence, although it's impossible to talk about violence when you're talking about genocide, but it's about how you do not create a spectacle of violence. And in the exhibition, I mean, there's really nothing there that that is so focusing on that specifically. But I've been using just sort of literature and other ways of thinking about resistance to it rather than describing the violence, if you see what I mean. But I'm not too sure how you can completely remove violence from the equation when you are talking about genocide and violence. It's there. It's more about how are you going to tackle it, how you're not going to make it a complete spectacle. And I think a lot of the times it's to think about how you use sources, how you use evidence as well. And I think, it doesn't happen many times to be in in presentations, for instance, with historians where, the wheel of showing proof is so important that then there's a recirculation of certain kind of imagery, which is not necessarily needed. If you see what I mean, we don't necessarily need to. I mean, if you are showing it, it's because we're implying that we are talking to white people mostly. Because if we are thinking that the audience that we are talking to and the work that we are doing is not just for white people, then we would really think about not recirculating those kind of images. If you see what I mean.
Okay. I see that. So you're thinking not only about your position, your location, but also that of the spectator in this case. Yeah. Okay.
I mean, I understand what you mean about cutting the image of kind of violence, but something is to cut an image of Berlusconi and Gaddafi, and something is to put out images of, people have been they've been photographed without consent in the colony, under duress. So I think it's different. Something is to sort of apply certain kind of method to trying to undo and deconstruct like a performance of politics, which is the meeting between Berlusconi and Gaddafi. And something else is to think about how, for instance, to speak about the genocide, and there's two kind of different issues.
And I can see that perhaps the only way forward is to make that process, that practice, as self-reflexive as possible. I mean, because I think there are still risks there. I mean, it could be argued that in fact it would be better not to have any image at all, because any image, like with the Holocaust, is potentially to be complicit in some way with fascism. I mean, there is that argument made. But you are dealing with images, you are cutting into images, you are performing, as you said, and I think that's quite a risky move, but it's also perhaps what is required within certain limits which you are clearly aware of and perhaps imposing on yourself, and they're always self-reflexive. Contingent limits.
Yeah, I mean, the voiceover of the film, obviously, only saw a very specific piece where I'm really engaging with the text of the treaty and so on. But throughout the film, I keep interrogating myself first. I always, make sure that where I am located, how I'm looking at things, the sort of limits that my position and, way of seeing are made as explicit as possible. because they are my take on things as well, So it's also the fact that I'm not trying to come up with, universal answers, but it's a very specific take. And for me, it's this kind of take I can, this is this kind of position and what I can do because of who I am and where I'm looking at things and how. And of course, it's extremely limited, but it's about really playing with those limits and making them as transparent and as up for debate as possible as well.
I'm with you on that. I understand. Well, listen, we have actually one chat, but it's by someone who's left the room, I think, unless Konago is still here. But he has left a chat and it has a question. He's on his way to get the bus to downtown Bilbao. I wonder if you are familiar with Samuel Opondo on what he calls diplomatic parasitations, and also on Gaddafi's diplomacy, whose gaze would enter easily into dialogue with yours. So that's I think his question.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not familiar with the first thing he's mentioning, the Samuel Opondo's diplomatic parasitation, and it would have been interesting to know what he means about Gaddafi's diplomacy. So, because obviously Gaddafi is a very complicated character to deal with and to approach, and the film talks a lot about this as well, especially the second act, because there's also the question of, how do you think about Gaddafi? Gaddafi, diplomacy. Obviously, we have the Gaddafi of the non-aligned movement. We have the Gaddafi of, the Pan-Africanists, the Pan-Arabists. So, and there's very different kind of characters, and he represents very different things. And it's very, and then of course he's the mad dog of the West, and where do you go from there? And to me is the fact that I try to, and I actually discuss this in the film because I'm not going to take a side. Obviously for me, I'm only looking at him as a dictator because he was a dictator, and the fact that he, what is rolling to those kind of very limited case study that I'm looking at. But also at the same time, the fact that Gaddafi came to sort of incarnate the Libyan nation and sort of always overshadow any access to Libyan experience, to Libyan people experience. So every time you're talking about Gaddafi, you're talking about Libya, you're never it's always very difficult to sort of detach Gaddafi from as an encapsulation of Libya. And so this becomes something that is always very present. A lot of the literature as well I've engaged with from different Libya scholars about this problem of always living in the shadow of this figure. And so this is something that I engage with, but I do not go. For the sake of this film, because it could go in so many directions and already is covering so much temporally, I try to be as close to the event as possible and only open up in directions that are really, really connected to it, because otherwise, even just Berlusconi could have been, another total film. So you have to be very sparing in the way you are engaging in a lot of the tangents that come out.
It's a shame that Noe can't be here to respond to you.
Yes.
So hopefully he's on the bus.
And maybe we can write.
So Fabrizio has his hand up. Fabrizio.
Yeah, I've just seen also another question in the chat, which is pretty much similar to what I was going to ask. But in fact, I'm very curious to hear more about the experience of the Maxi Bulgari Prize. A little bit of gossip as well, maybe.
The gossip. I'm not going to go into detail.
I mean, are we to gather that things are changing, that this ethnographic silence, is changing? I mean, the kind of approach to it. And also the news that you've just, just let us know about the feature film being made out of this. So if you can tell us a little bit more about this, also the reception in general, and also as the person in the chat said, have you had any chance to engage with the Libyan audience? So that's also very interesting. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you also people in the chat. And yeah, I mean, it's not always easy in Italy. Like, I mean, I get a lot of really great reception from a lot of people and a lot of, I work a lot in Italy. I try to do as much, especially in terms of pedagogic kind of practice. And it's, you can feel that there's a lot of, there is desire to engage in certain conversation, and there is engagement. But at the same time, there's also, it's not always as straightforward to do this kind of work in Italy. And there's, I talk to you in private, but you know that there have been different episodes which have been that often to a British audience, my colleagues always kind of cannot believe that this kind of stuff happened to me in Italy. But it does happen even in academic environments of being attacked in verbal way, but kind of strong ways. Then through the Maxi, there has been a lot of media exposure, so there has been a little bit of heat coming from the far right that I received, although a lot of it had ended up being expressed through also fat-shaming comments, which is also part of, being who I am in Italy and, putting my face and my body out there. And yeah, but, overall, obviously it's a position film, and in the current climate, we know what's, the kind of political context that we are in. So sometimes you do have some sort of resistance somehow from the institutions. In this case, I call it I just managed to finish the film just before the government fell, which kind of surrounded somehow the debate, around the film while it was, in the exhibition before the award ceremony. But still, the film, we were 3 finalists, and it is 6 years of research, and it managed to go through. There was also an international jury, so I was very pleased for sure. But I thought, a lot of people told me how they felt it was an important thing happening just before the new director of the Maxi is installed. As we know, he's coming from the far right. The Maxi being a museum where I exhibited the work. So I don't know what the next year is going to look like. Obviously, after certain other kind of resistance I've had from other institutions, having won the prize is giving me that kind of edge where they can't really ignore me because I won that prize. So it's helping to have the kind of conversations, I think, in a way. But there's also a lot of heat that you get behind closed doors, a lot of kind of blackmailing somehow. And that's when I say I have a privilege being in England doing the research I do here with the resources here, because it doesn't make me as I cannot be as blackmailed as I would be if I would be in Italy somehow, in terms of, being coerced to do certain things to get funding or this kind of stuff. But yeah, it's not always easy. And in terms of engaging the Libyan audiences, yes, not as much as I would like to yet, but there have been certain events, there have been certain, and it will be more and more this year, I hope. There is something in the back burner, sort of happening behind the scene. So hopefully soon there will be a bit more engagement, but I am in touch and in conversation with quite a few, scholars, colleagues that, we kind of, that help me out and give me feedback and so on.
Fabrizio, is that okay?
Thank you.
Okay, I'm going to ask you, we talked about this just before. My chat has blocked, so if there's anything new in the chat, please do shout. But I'm aware of hands up, and first of all, it's Eduardo, and then it's Anissa. Eduardo.
Hi, yeah. Maybe this is not like directly related to the goal of your research, but I was wondering if, since you have been working so long on this material and archives, if you have kind of come up with your own idea or explanation why we do have this kind of awkward narrative towards our colonial past in Italy. And I was thinking of the very awkward speech that made, I don't know if you remember that in 2019, Manlio Di Stefano was one of the Five Stars movement, and he said that basically we don't have a colonial past in Italy, and we didn't bomb anything, and we didn't hang anybody, which was totally shocking for me. But I guess this is a sign of something very, how to say, like something opposed to what's going on in the rest of the Western world. So any country in the West is basically getting to grips with its own colonial past, while in Italy it's something we just don't talk, and there's no TV series or films. There's really just a little about this. And I mean, I know it's not the goal of your research, but why do you think it is that, if I can ask you?
It's a loaded question, and there's, I think, quite a lot of phenomena that sort of intersected in making this the present reality. I do remember very well the Manlio Di Stefano, what he said. I've used it for the performance lecture I made before the film, actually. But there is a very similar quote by Fini, who in 2004 said something very, very similar. And I think we have this sort of established narratives that associated with Italy, with sort of way of sort of denying the past. That obviously the most famous being Italiani brava gente, like Italians good people, but also the idea of colonialismo straccione, so the idea of sort of pauper colonialism, where we weren't very successful at colonialism, so we shouldn't really talk about it because we didn't get much out of it, or the idea that, I mean, obviously this is the rhetoric. I don't agree with that. And actually, this is something I am confronted with also when I speak about Italian colonialism sometime in British context and in French context, where it's like, oh yeah, I get the joke, come on, it's not much, And it always strikes me how, colonialism is still a value in terms of success in a way. And a lot of the time, the work I'm trying to do more and more is to place Italian colonialism within, a bigger timeline of and relations of, European imperialism, because obviously it's one phenomenon, and is very, very linked. And seeing how the kind of impact, global impact, that actually Italian colonialism has had to sort of, I think it's really as part of trying to be accountable for it is also trying to place it in context. But in Italy, I mean, we have, this idea of conspiracy of silence, with this idea of, the removal. There's all sort of different explanations for it. Oh, surely the amnesty that we had, for which fascism wasn't, we didn't go through the fascistizations, that also included a lot of the talks around colonialism, because we lost most colonies during the end of the Second World War. But then you also have a surviving of colonial propaganda right after, even with the first anti-fascist governments, right after the end of the fascist regime, and a push to get the colonies back, which resulted in the AFIS, the financial trusteeship in Somalia in 1950-60. So there is this thing that the fact that colonialism has been present throughout the history, and if you look at the foreign politics, is very, very present, but it's been deliberately not addressed and not talked about. So, the idea of colonial agents also being very much there, but people can't really name it or recognize it. And of course, the education system has a big role in this. And for me, that's why after having worked for many years in museum and gallery education, I started my practice, and doing workshop in school was, for me, super important. It always goes with my projects. I do a film and a long sort of program in schools, and I think starting from there could be a way. But yeah, sorry, I went through a few tangents there.
Thank you. Okay,
Thank you.
We pass to Anissa.
Well, first, thank you for this very interesting talk about a part of history which I knew virtually nothing about. So thank you. And just have two questions. First one just continues what we were talking about earlier about bringing to the surface, through that dissecting method, what is hidden or invisible, and trying to break the time frame of the past and present, as trauma, as we know, is kind of bring both into the same kind of level. How do we bring, my question is, how do we bring what we call undocumented migrants? I don't like that term because it's so abstract and denies individuality. And precisely because of that, how do we bring going back to the effect, to the individual, to the body, to the experience, back into the conversation? I appreciate what you were saying about not reproducing the violence of the gays, because of colonial histories have kind of had visual violence as part of their project. But how do we speak about, if not represent, those lives that matter? And also, the other question is, I was intrigued by the figure, I don't know what it was, a Roman statue or something on the left of Gaddafi. I was thinking, is that the absent? I don't know. Am I reading too much into it? But I'm intrigued the way you cut it out as well. So yeah, this is what I'm interested in. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, I mean, I've done work on sort of more specifically on work a few years ago called Radio Gate Relay, which is mostly looking at a radio that's different, mostly tomato pickers in southern Italy that are exploited, and the sort of their voice. And to me, let's say, there was something I felt comfortable in doing because of working with them and working with an archive of voice and very empowered voice, away from a sort of looking at documenting through images the sort of dehumanizing conditions in which they live. And a lot of the media outlets were going there because they had a radio, but they were taking pictures of the barracks in which they were living and not listening to what they had to say and actually mediating their voice. But in this work, I do talk about the bilateral agreements more in depth, but it's not a work in this case that was allowing me to go in that direction. And I think for me, there's also that relation is like, how do you do what you say, how you bring those without being exploitative as well? And, and am I able to do it? And what do I concentrate on? And I think for me, and most of the time I try to concentrate on something that I feel I'm able to tackle because of where I am and what I'm doing, rather than, and then if there is a situation like in that specific case where I have a certain access and way that I feel that is not completely exploitative of doing something, then I'll give it a chance. But otherwise, it's not, let's say that it's not my main goal looking for that, because to me, it requires certain kind of also often ethnographic approach to filmmaking that I am not particularly comfortable with for many reasons, and perhaps most people just the way I am and my limits as well. But I understand what you mean, and to me, but there's also the risk, like how do you do it in a way that it doesn't become like giving a voice, this kind of ways that recreate the same kind of power imbalances as well. And I decided to focus much more on deconstructing, my experience, which is also a shared experience, and sort of to sort of try to develop this sort of accountability in a way. But that kind of work requires, I think, another set of parameters, a way of doing things. And as for the image, yes, so part of the reparations between Italy and Libya included the repatriation of the statue that you saw there, which is the Venus of Cyrene, which is a Roman copy of a Greek statue that was unearthed in 1913 by the Italians, and then was looted, and then it was returned in 2008 during the first signing of the bilateral agreements, which took place in Benghazi. And that image is quite incredible because they are holding hands, they are looking at the breast of the Venus of Cyrene, really. And I always said that I always make a point that is not a comical image, because a lot of people laugh when they see that image, and because of also what Gaddafi and Berlusconi do together when they are together, the sort of specular kind of characters that they are. And I think a lot of the time, especially when I'm in here in the UK, there's an approach to it which it looks grotesque and comical, but obviously for me it's always let's step back. These are two dictators basically. Yes, they are misogynist, and we know what they're doing here, but and I joke sometimes just saying that the image allow me to get funding most of the time, because people just seem to find it funny, and it's something I've been actually reflecting a lot on, this idea of laughing about this image in the performance lecture I actually did.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
There are a couple of questions in the chat, but I don't know whether we have time.
I'm talking too much.
Well, no, these are important questions and they deserve proper answers, so thank you for that. I think we do have a bit of time. I'm very happy if you are, Alessandra, to go over.
Okay.
Yeah.
The first question is from a student who's still in Italy, quite aware of the limitations even of the academic field when it comes to the colonial past. Basically, she's wondering whether you would consider to adapt your work for showing it outside university and museums. I don't know whether this is also a good moment to tell us a little bit more about the feature film.
Oh, yeah.
And in fact, the other question is from Eric, who had to leave, a colleague of ours, and he's asking about the remediation of that complex material and the decisions you had to make in terms of how to display it. And in fact, this is interesting because obviously when you made the film, it was one thing, then it became an installation, and then it's going to become a feature film. Can you take us through this journey? Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Just for the first question, yes. Once the film, I have unofficially showed it at Pitch Out during the strikes at Liverpool University last 2 months ago. And, I come from alternative spaces and communities, so it will surely circulate. I'm not sure when the feature film will be finished and how, and the kind of restrictions I will have on that for a bit, because you do have restrictions in terms of distribution and so on. But I'm always happy to make the film available. And in fact, my very first film, which is used a lot in universities and so on, which really looks at why we don't know much about colonialism, which was Eduardo's question as well, and is online, is available. Another film as well. So I tend to leave things accessible when possible. And as for the remediation, it's very complicated because I start with most of the material for years. It lives with me. I collect things. There's also the question of not having access to archives, not having access to resources as much as I want. So I use a small grant, for instance, to collect things, which is not always great because you're buying colonial fascist things. You're not really, so, but also you take them out of the market, which is not bad. And is the fact that then I have complete autonomy on how I use them in a way of scanning them, and that when if you're working with an archive, everything you want to do, you have to go through, a lot of processes as well. And to me, this work was very much to more think about this idea of archival coloniality rather than archives and institutional archives and sort of archival material from institutions, to really sort of working outside and also think about what's available out there. So what you can actually get online, what you can actually find online, and sort of this kind of work, which is much more looking for traces that are out there. And a lot of the work, yes, as I was explaining in the beginning, that I do does work on this sort of turning things from one thing to another. So the film was first a performance lecture that changed, had different kind of iterations throughout the years, because also it was very difficult to say stop to the research, because like just the 2nd of November, they reiterated they ratified the Treaty of Friendship and the sort of memorandum of understanding between Italy and Libya. So that was just 2-3 months ago. So it's a constantly evolving story. There's some material that's specifically violent, or even like Berlusconi saying really, really violent things in terms of use of language that I deliberately did not use. So it was also, sort of a way of thinking what is used, how, if you're using something in a performance lecture as well, is different than in a film. So also thinking about the difference between, looking at something in passing while you're present, or, making something that sort of more set in stone that is on a loop in a exhibition space. So, because also I have the opportunity where I am doing a performance lecture to interact with things in a different way, in a direct way. So then the material changes between the different contexts a bit, for sure, and you have to take into account how every format of presentation and every medium has different limits and different potentials. So then it's a trial and error, and try to rethink the content in those kind of ways. And the feature film, I cannot tell you much yet. It's still like in the making, and there will be a book, but it's all like in the making.
Thank you, Alessandra.
Thank you.
It's a fascinating process, and it's really, I can't wait to see the next stages as the project evolves. There was one question which I'm not sure we did cover, and it was earlier in the chat, which I've now managed to catch, and it was from Galadriel. Have you had a chance to engage with a Libyan audience?
I did answer to it before. Yeah.
Did you answer it? Okay, fine.
Yeah, when Fabrizio asked this question, it was
very good. Okay. That's great. Then there are no, please confirm, Fabrizio, there's no further chat?
No.
No? And I can't see any more hands up?
No.
Brilliant.
So maybe that is the cue then to, for the moment, leave it there, and to thank you again for such an exciting talk. And all the chats have acknowledged just what a wonderful talk it was, and congratulations. So, we wish you the best for the PhD, Alessandra, and all the next stages of the project as it evolves. And we will put the recording of this session onto our CVC website as soon as we can.